Okay, I'll try to make this relatively brief. So here's what I see as happening in Africa. So a lot of people may not remember this, but I'm a history nerd, current events nerd, all that. So around the time of 2013, no, I think it was even before that, 2011. Correct me if I'm wrong there. That's when Libya popped off. Benghazi, all that nonsense. Tons of weapons flowed into Libya. Gaddafi was ousted relatively quickly. And those weapons, well, no one wants to say what happened to those weapons, but someone did say what happened to those weapons, because Wikipedia released Bradley Manning's State Department cables, and in those cables there were diplomats who might have been glowies as well, basically discussing how these weapons that were in Libya that were given to all these people, a lot of them had left, and they noted that some of them were going to Syria, and the diplomats were perfectly fine with that. We're told this is what we want. Basically, that's okay. Now, around the same time as the war in Libya was winding down, I think low-intensity combat continued and still continues to this day, but the main action died down. Then you start hearing about Boko Haram popping up in Nigeria, northern Nigeria. I think up in this little area right here, right on the border of Niger and Nigeria. So it didn't take that much of a genius to figure out that they probably got some weapons from Libya. Maybe even I suspect, because Libya remained a very closed society, and to this day it's very closed. A lot of surveillance. I mean, from what I understand, you really got to tiptoe your way around there. So I wouldn't be surprised if a pipeline of weapons continued through Libya into that area of the world and into Mali. This is the Sahara Desert, okay? This is the Sahara Desert. It's an ocean of sand. One of the most remote regions on Earth that still remains, besides maybe Antarctica. I can see weapons being able to be smuggled through here. So then you start to have Boko Haram pop up and other Islamic fundamentalists just pop up. And they never really had a problem with this before. I mean, these are Muslim countries. They have been Muslim countries for thousands of years. Well, not thousands. Let's say 1,000 years. Or more, a little more. Basically, these countries became Muslim because the Abbasid Caliphate and other Islamic caliphates started penetrating into Africa, and they encountered sub-Saharan Africans through these basically passes. There were essentially ways to get through the Sahara that were dotted with oases, and these became trade routes, and they ran into these sub-Saharan Africans, and the sub-Saharan Africans, for a variety of reasons, including so that they couldn't be enslaved outright by the raiding Arabs, converted to Islam and formed this sort of buffer of Islamic kingdoms between the Arabs, and then you have sub-Saharan Islamic societies here. Of course, they would go deeper into Africa back before this area converted really to Islam, and they would raid these places and trade with these, mostly trade with these people down here who were pagans at the time, and therefore fair game under Sharia law, and trade for slaves. And then that would start basically the slave trade as we know it. It wasn't the Europeans who started the slave trade. The slave trade started exactly as I just showed you. The Arabs also, sailed down the east coast of Africa, and that's why to this day Swahili, a language spoken really in this whole region here, is a basically a mixture of Arabic and African. You know, this area, Swahili, and Swahili actually penetrates deeper into Africa as a language, into the Congo. People in the Congo speak Swahili. Very common language in Africa. It's one language that you can learn and get around quite a bit in this part of Africa, even in Somalia, Ethiopia. It's kind of like a common language. So that's where these countries originate as Islamic countries. So they've been Islamic for a long time. Up until recently, you know, Islamic fundamentalism wasn't really a problem. It wasn't really a thing. Islamic terrorism, until the last 20 years that I remember, wasn't really a big deal. Now, Sudan had their problems, which is a bit more complicated than religious in nature, although I suspect there is religion involved. So then you have the Europeans and the United States coming in and saying, oh, we can help you with these Islamic fundamentalists. Oh, yeah, we're great at fighting. The United States and especially France comes in and like, oh, yeah, we have very advanced military. We'll take care of these Islamic fundamentalists. And you had a war in Mali, a low-intensity conflict between French forces and allied forces against some sort of Islamic fundamentalist groups that seem to pop out of nowhere. And you see that happening in Niger. I'm not sure about Chad. And now, recently, we've seen a spat of coups going on in the last 2 years or so. No, maybe last year. It started with Guinea about a year and a half ago. Then it became Mali, okay, kicked their government out and basically did a military government. I think Guinea wasn't totally successful. Burkina Faso was a successful coup, and they drove all of these countries, Mali and Burkina Faso, threw out the French troops and other foreign people that were involved in this war with these fundamentalists that seemed to pop out of the sand. And then you have Niger being the latest one. And they have the same issues that Mali and Burkina Faso have. They're tired of being de facto French colonies. You see, colonialism didn't actually end in the 1960s and 70s. It's continued to this day. It continues now. You know, in their typical underhanded, dishonest way, what the Europeans essentially did was say, "Sure, we'll grant you independence," but in reality, they made sure that they were never truly independent after that. I mean, South Africa remained under apartheid until the 1980s, I believe. When I was a kid, they were still doing it. You know, we've had Mozambique a while back, I believe, has kicked out, has basically done the same thing with the foreign influence. The Africans are actually getting sick of the Europeans and the Americans. I think what they're coming to realize is that the IMF money and the USAID money and the NED money, it's not helping them. I mean, the political class, sure, they can get rich off of that stuff. But it doesn't matter if your people hate you for, you know, basically taking bribes from foreign countries. So even the political class has had to come to the realization that the people of their countries aren't going to stand for the Western influence. Of all people in the world to go to Africa and tell the Africans what to do with their countries, I think the Europeans are the last people that should be even suggesting anything, given the history. Russia and China, don't have this same historical legacy. So what we're seeing is a shift, a polar shift, which is actually a monumental shift in attitudes from favoring a partnership with Europe, okay, to favoring a partnership instead with Russia and China. Okay. This is the future. And I think that, obviously, the Americans and the Europeans won't accept that without some level of resistance. Right? But I think the writing's already on the wall there. That's what's happening. You know, famously, the United States State Department, and this has been in the news here and there, has been fucking with Uganda because Uganda isn't inclusive and, you know, they don't respect LGBTQ rights enough. Now, I don't understand what planet you're on if you think people in Washington, D.C., these weak, pathetic, bureaucratic cocksuckers, are going to go to Uganda and tell the Ugandans, you guys have to now accept homosexuality. And how they've attempted to do it is with foreign aid, lots of foreign aid, most of which goes to bribing political people, the political class, the judges, just really buying out the whole political system. A country like the United States can relatively effortlessly buy out the entire government of a place like Uganda. Then what happens? Once you got them all bought out, whatever country it is, Congo, whatever country, then now you can get deals for maybe mining companies or oil companies to come in and have exclusive rights to natural resources. See how that works? And what's happening, though, is that the political class has had to acknowledge that it is not politically beneficial for them to openly take basically bribes at this level while letting their populations suffer. The IMF seems to come with too many strings attached. A lot of countries are having second thoughts on whether they want to actually have an IMF relationship. So that's what's happening in Africa. It's happening to a lesser extent in South America, but still happening, with Brazil and Lula being really a center of power in Latin America. And meanwhile, the West is basically imploding on itself like a dying star. And eventually it may go supernova and really rock the world in a cataclysm. It's possible. But the Africans are starting to say enough is enough with the Europeans. That's what's happening. And now France is not even really putting on airs anymore. They are actually saying, well, if you guys don't put that president in, we're going to do airstrikes because we need the uranium. And it comes down to that. But shouldn't Niger be able to sell their uranium on the open market? Why give exclusive rights to it to France? See, that's not fair to Niger or the Nigerian people. Nigerian people is what I learned today. Not to be confused with Nigerian. Nigerian. That's how you're supposed to say the adjective. And we're seeing what's happening in Africa happen in the Middle East. We're seeing it happen in Central Asia. Georgia just signed a pretty big deal, from what I understand, with China, a big economic strategic cooperation deal. Afghanistan, obviously, and China are talking. So there's a lot going on in the world, and it all seems to indicate basically a rejection of this liberal world order, which isn't liberal, and it's not really orderly. It's really just a global kleptocracy, and people are starting to see that. Even the politicians who have benefited from this arrangement for so long in places like Africa, South America, are starting to see that if they want to have a sustainable political career, they're going to have to play this a bit more carefully. And they can't just let the United States and Europe come in and rob them of their resources. It's just not going to work that way. The people are getting pissed there. That's what's really happening. Attitudes are changing. The court of public opinion, the opinion of the court, the opinion of the public is swinging, like a pendulum. It's gone from the 90s to the early 2000s. Very excessively, the pendulum has swung towards the United States and Europe, and now it's swinging the other way. The pendulum never stops swinging, really. So Niger is basically a consequence of this, the latest iteration of this big shift in attitudes in Africa. We're seeing Africans being more and more vocal about European partnerships and lack of maybe mutual respect in those partnerships. Kenya's president is one of those. The president of Tanzania that died a few years ago, he was certainly an independent-minded dude that the people loved because he was a populist and he did deals with China, and the people loved that. Because the people of Africa understand that colonialism is still ongoing, although we might now actually be reaching the end of it. So that's my take on what's going on in Africa. And we can see possibly a major regional war break out, and if France gets involved in that with air power, I'm not sure if that's going to be good for anyone. It's looking a lot more like World War I, just in the way this is playing out. That's not a good thing. So I am out.